the district lines so that we go back to equal numbers of people. Why does this really matter? Well, redistricting matters because communities that are together in a district can have more of a voice with their elected officials. There are some very specific rules in the Federal Voting Rights Act that Sarah's going to talk about, and about that create rules for putting communities into a district. And then beyond that, she'll tell you about trying to keep people together, and the conflicts that you get with overlapping communities. Um, so what are the rules for the State Redistricting Commission, which is independent? They do the redistricting for the state legislature, for Congress, and the Board of Equalization. And I will say that the California Redistricting Commission is considered the gold standard for independent redistricting in the United States. Their process is done all in public. So we see 14 Californians setting themselves up and then doing the work. And it can get messy at times. There's 14 opinionated people, then they don't always work in harmony or think alike. I keep reminding myself that if we really want neat and clean government, we probably want a dictator, that democracy is inherently messy. And we can see that in the commission, but we got the work done. The rules that the commission uses to draw the lines are very clearly delineated, and there's a ranked set of criteria that starts with equal population. That we talked about that. And then compliance with the Federal Voting Rights Act. Being contiguous, that all of one district needs to be touching each other. You can't have a piece of it here where I am in Oakland and another piece down in Claremont. And then comes the criterion that is the one where there's the most discussion. The commission is charged with respecting city and county lines and communities of interest, and that's all equal. And so there's a lot of balancing, and it's a lot of human judgment in there. There are some lower criteria below that about being compact and nesting, but they say only do those if you can do it while respecting everything else. And then finally, they can't look at where incumbents live. And so it is that is the way the rules work. I talk a little bit about being an observer and the league role. The League of Women Voters of California was one of the primary proponents of the original initiative that created the Independent Redistricting Commission. And I think those of you who were in the league at the time remember that fight. We really campaigned hard for it. Being the league, we don't rest when something passes. We are as concerned about the implementation as we are about getting the policy changed. So we watched and commented all during the 2010 redistricting cycle, and we actually continued to be there for the rest of the 10 years. And the commission would meet on a regular basis, and we sent observers to those meetings. So as the 2020 cycle started, we were there. We worked as part of a coalition. Our work is most closely aligned with Common Cause because our two organizations are focused on the process rather than the actual maps. But that said, we were part of a broad coalition of voting rights groups. The rest of the coalition, not including Common Cause and the League, spoke about maps. So they advocated for particular boundaries in particular areas. We saw our role as supportive of them. We wanted to make sure that they were being heard. They were our partners in a whole lot of voting rights areas. And while we didn't speak about the maps, we wanted to make sure that those underrepresented communities were heard and their voices were raised and listened to. A couple of observations. We have lots of attention on redistricting right now. There's a number of bills being introduced in the legislature that actually deal mostly with local redistricting. But there's one right now that looks like it's actually trying to limit the people who are paid for their work from being able to speak to the state commission. On the surface, that may sound appealing because we talk about paid lobbyists, but it really looks like it's something that's trying to limit community-based organizations from having staff that speak for that community. We're, as the league and along with our partner organizations, are watching that bill, and we'll definitely speak if that one gets a hearing. Meanwhile, the commissioners are working on their report for the next commission. Our groups are also doing a report, and we're going to watch for ways that we can help make the 2030 process even better than this one. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Sara.
All right, thanks so much, Helen. And it's so nice to be at this point after the maps are done. We've had no litigation, and finally I get to interact with Helen in this way. She was stalking us for months, but providing really helpful feedback and input along the way that really helped guide our process. So my big thanks to you. So, I wanted to just start off a little bit about the process of selection, because this is something I'm thinking a whole lot about. I'm often asked, why on earth did you apply? What made you interested in the Redistricting Commission? And, I was aware of the commission. I was actually working in social justice and racial justice organizations back in 2008 when the proposition was on the ballot. I had been the project director for immigrant rights at what was then the Asian Pacific American Legal Center, now Asian Americans Advancing Justice. And so I was very much aware of the process when it was being adopted. And in 2010, many of my colleagues were following along closely. It wasn't something I had, thought that I had a burning desire to do. But there had been an article in the LA Times about the fact that the applicant pool, when applications were first opened, was lacking in diversity. And so as a woman of color, I thought, let me put my name in the hat. I was one of 20,000 people who had initially applied for the commission. So I never really put too much stock into it. I didn't really think that I would make it all the way through. There's multiple steps to that process of writing essays, kind of showing your commitment to California's diversity, to being fair and equitable, to being able to work across the aisle. All of those are some of the components needed to serve on the commission. And having been through the full experience, I can tell you those qualities were absolutely essential. And I lay that out only because 10 years from now, hopefully some of you who are watching will also consider applying to the commission, because definitely it's an underrated job, but one that's incredibly important for representation in our state. When I was selected to the commission, I will say, having come from that background in social justice advocacy, and then as a scholar, I left the social justice world and pursued a PhD in political science. Most of my research, and I had the opportunity to come and talk with the League of Women Voters about a year and a half ago about some of my research. Most of it looks at communities of color and analyzing vote trends and voter behavior predominantly focused on Latino and Asian American communities. And so when I came to the commission, the process is that the first 6 are selected through a lottery ball. I'm doing that just like the super lotto. They rumble up all of the balls, and the first few that come out are selected. And that's how I was selected, which is quite a shock, because I don't typically feel like I'm a super lucky person in that regard, but it was my lucky day. But interestingly, there were no Latinos selected to the first 6. And having come from that perspective of social justice and concern, a deep concern about representation and what it means to be represented, that didn't sit well with me. And in the early stages, I was really concerned that I was gearing up for a battle, looking at the world around me, including here in California during the pandemic, which was when we were selected in July of 2020. We see a lot of vitriol in American politics. It's pretty rare that we see Democrats and Republicans getting along. So I didn't know what was in store. I didn't know if this was going to be the fight of our lives, right, on the Redistricting Commission. What I came to realize, however, was that truly all of the commissioners had a shared belief and expectation for a fair process and for fair representation and to follow the law. And it was one of the pieces that I think most pleasantly surprised me in all of this, was that you could get a group of folks together from different walks of life, from very different parts, even of California, of different races, genders, religion and creed. And somehow we were able to pull it all together and work towards these maps from a perspective of shared values. Helen had talked about the ranked criteria that the commission has, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about that, and then hopefully put it within the context of, this extraordinarily diverse group of 14 Californians that came together. Our first criteria is equal population. And I know for some of the students that are on, I recognize some of my own students who are in the attendee list. We might study Baker v. Carr, a Supreme Court case that required equal population in congressional districts. And for congressional districts in particular, that's an extraordinarily high standard, because we were typically getting the districts to an equal amount based on with a deviation of one person, right? So that's how much we're talking about when we're talking about equal population. In the state legislative districts, there's opportunity for a little bit more flexibility. We were working on a plus or minus, I think it was like plus or minus 5%, something like that. So there's an opportunity to keep cities together perhaps a little bit more when possible, when you have a little bit greater deviation there, right? And we might think about why that might be the case, right? From a federal policy requirement versus the state policy requirements to some extent. And so that's one of the key pieces that we had to balance, because it's our number one priority. But our second ranked criteria is compliance with the Federal Voting Rights Act. And I know I have a couple students on here from my public policy class this semester, and we're doing a deep dive on voting rights and the current movement to try and improve voting rights legislation in this country, which is largely stalled at this point. But some of the key components to the Voting Rights Act, and we could probably do a whole session on the VRA alone. First, let me also just note that there is a Federal Voting Rights Act and a California Voting Rights Act, and those two are very separate pieces of legislation. I think a lot of folks probably in Claremont have some familiarity with the California Voting Rights Act, which will push cities and smaller municipalities to adopt district elections, to move away from at-large elections largely for the purposes of better representation for historically excluded and minoritized communities. But for the Federal Voting Rights Act, it provides a number of protections for communities that have been historically disenfranchised or excluded from the political process. And in California, that largely means the Latinx community. That's not to say other communities, that the VRA doesn't apply to them, but there are certain criteria that emerge from the VRA through Supreme Court case law, which sets out a number of criteria that you have to assess to identify when and where a community might meet the threshold of VRA protection. And predominantly that includes the Latino community here in California. So because that is our second criteria, much of our work throughout the state was assessing our Voting Rights Act obligations. We had set it up in such a way, there's the litigation components to VRA law, the VRA laws are such that much of it was being done by our legal team and running the analysis on voting trends throughout the state to identify those areas. But that was a key component that guided our process. And as I had said from the get-go, I wasn't sure what to expect when I was first seated on the commission. Certainly ensuring that Latino commissioners were able to serve on the commission was an initial first priority for me. But as we moved forward and learning more about our criteria, ensuring compliance with the VRA, especially kind of given my academic background, if you will, working on voting trends, was a very clear priority for me. I served on our VRA subcommittee that looked at more of the analysis and helped to set up many of the legal components that we ended up using. And what I was, again, pleasantly surprised to find was that amongst all of the commissioners, everybody wanted to adhere to the VRA. That's not the case everywhere. Certainly, if we take a look in other states around the country today, we see that whether it's less so commissions, I think, but certainly in the case of state legislatures, a real movement to dilute the power of the vote for communities of color. We're seeing that in Texas, where there are lawsuits being brought against the state. We've seen it in North Carolina, where their maps were recently struck down, certainly in Alabama as well. So it was something that I wanted to ensure our commission was highly cognizant of. And what I found was that I had great partners amongst not only Democrats, but Republicans and independents as well. And truly, the entire commission took to heart our mandate to live up to the obligations of the VRA, and our commission expanded VRA districts, Latino majority minority districts throughout the state in all of our maps, making our maps relatively proportional to the Latino population here in California. And I'm happy to answer additional questions about that as well. I wanted to also just, however, before I end, pick up on this notion of communities of interest. This is a big one. It's an important criteria, though ranked lower than equal population and VRA, but at the same level, as Helen mentioned, as respecting city and county boundaries. What are communities of interest? Like who goes around and talks about like, oh yeah, this is my community of interest, right? You don't walk through your neighborhood and think about what your community of interest is. It's loosely defined, and that's one of the challenges. It's one of the opportunities and one of the challenges, I think, of this notion of communities, or this way of thinking about communities. Loosely defined, we think about communities that are connected based on social or economic ties. And so that could be anything from a historic community to, with local traditional cultures or local parades or celebrations that are important to the community, to communities that are tied by, for example, a mountain range, which was the case certainly in the Claremont area. It could be, a transportation corridor. It could even be racial and ethnic communities. And certainly we heard from a number of groups who maybe don't fit all of the criteria to be protected officially under our Voting Rights Act obligations, but who nonetheless wanted to stay together as a community. Certainly we saw that being the case for example, the LGBTQ communities and Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. We had a lot of feedback from the Black community throughout the state in areas where they wouldn't necessarily meet VRA compliance requirements, but nonetheless felt a strong urgency to stay together. And so over the course of those months working on the maps, we had to really try and balance all of those communities of interest testimony, as well as things like respecting city and county borders. Throughout the process, we spent many months collecting testimonies from communities on the ground. I think what set the 2020 Commission apart from 2010 is we had an extended timeline, largely due to the delay in the census data, which required a whole conversation about when we would actually get our maps done. But with that extra time, it was important to all of us as commissioners to make sure we go out and spread the word about redistricting, tell people what communities of interest means generally, and get them ready to share their input with us. So we spent many months doing outreach, going to community organizations, chambers of commerce, business associations, student groups, and providing presentations on what redistricting is. It tends to be a process that people don't think a whole lot about, and for good reason. It happens once every 10 years, and in most states happens behind closed doors, and the public never has an opportunity to get involved. And so we're trying slowly to change that process and make sure that more Californians know that the process is going on, understand the stakes, and can have the tools to be involved. In terms of those tools, we worked with a statewide database, and they prepared a number of incredible mapping tools that communities on the ground could use. They were available in, I can't even remember how many languages, so many languages, so that hopefully it could be as accessible as possible. Throughout the summer of 2021, we spent, my goodness, almost 5 days a week, I think, in hearings, collecting testimony from groups. It was a tragedy for all of us on the commission that we were unable to travel around the state due to the pandemic situations, but Zoom also created an opportunity for more people to participate in ways that they perhaps couldn't have otherwise, right? From the comfort of your home. Certainly, I know as a working mom, it's not always easy to take time out of your day and go to a public meeting. So it was, I think Zoom worked out fairly well, though certainly from the commissioner perspective, we would have preferred to have been able to go and visit the places before having to draw the lines. And then lastly, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the maps in this local area in Southern California. Certainly Claremont sits at a unique position on the boundary of Los Angeles and San Bernardino counties. Throughout this region, we received a host of testimony. And I wanted to just kind of lay some of that out, which hopefully will provide some context for why the lines look the way that they do. First of all, one of the key pieces, as I alluded to moments ago, is the mountain range. We heard a lot about keeping what was often referred to as the 210 corridor area together, bringing from all the way from where I live here in La Cañada near Pasadena, all the way across through to Claremont and or beyond, to maintain some of the interests of the 210, but also to maintain the interests of the mountains, the environmental concerns that go into forest management. Certainly from both federal and state perspectives, of course, we know that we've had very large forest fires, and wanting to have representation that can coordinate excuse me 1 minute, I can hear my daughter in the background, to ensure adequate representation from that perspective. So for example, if you look at our congressional maps, you'll see the 28th congressional district includes, I believe includes Claremont, and also much of the San Gabriel Mountains as well. We received a ton of input on that from environmental groups, as well as from Asian American and Pacific Islander groups, who really felt that portions of the San Gabriel Valley, they would want to have that maintained in that district. As we move further out, or throughout the region, actually, there's a number of VRA considerations. Sorry, I'm just seeing there's a Google Doc that's being posted, so maybe that'll help identify some of these regions. And the maps are available on our website also at wedrawthelines.org. If you take a look at, for example, the congressional maps, you'll notice there's a number of districts in the San Gabriel Valley and San Bernardino and into Riverside areas. If you take a look, for example, at the new 33rd Congressional District, or the 39th and the 35th, you'll note that those are all districts that have Latino populations over 50%. Those were areas where we were building out VRA districts. One of the things that we found as we were contemplating the VRA districts throughout the region is that Los Angeles, there's really a cluster of Latino Latino populations, Latino communities living together there. And one of the pieces that we wanted to take a look at is spreading communities throughout districts where possible, so as to ensure that we are not packing them into any one district. So often when we think about redistricting, we'll think about packing and cracking districts. Certainly we didn't want to crack districts in ways that didn't make sense. But at the same time, particularly from a VRA standpoint, when we're thinking about voting power for historically excluded communities, we also didn't want to overly pack communities into districts. By spreading them out over multiple districts, it actually allows for those communities to have potentially have greater representation. And so we'll see that throughout the region, that was the case as we were building out some of these districts. And because the Voting Rights Act, the Federal Voting Rights Act, is our second criteria, it meant that we largely had to build those districts first, ensure that we were building them in such a way that would be compliant with the law, and then think about what neighborhoods were left around them that weren't built into the communities. Is it possible to respect a city's boundaries while maintaining a VRA district? If not, then what are our alternatives? And so much of our time was spent kind of going back and forth and shifting a line just slightly to see, would that make a difference? Would that lessen the power of the Latino vote in those areas? Throughout San Bernardino and Riverside, we had also received a lot of testimony from African-American communities. There's been a great exodus of many Black communities from Los Angeles into the Riverside and San Bernardino areas. Much of the testimony, the communities of interest testimony, had asked to be kept together in those Latino VRA districts. And so to the extent possible, we tried to also keep together Black and Latino voters where it was feasible to do so. But at the end of the day, the VRA considerations had to take a higher priority. So I think I will stop there and happy to take questions. Really when it came down to it, it was about balancing all of these different priorities and doing so in a way that respected our time frame as well. That was extraordinarily important to us. We've seen commissions in other states simply not meet their time frame, and then the power to redistrict is taken away and taken over by the courts. So we certainly did not want that to be the case for us here in California. And given another 6 months, these maps could have been totally different. But the maps could be drawn a million different ways. But I'm really proud of the work that we did here in California, and look forward to hearing your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of you. I popped a few links into the chat there. The first two are a couple of just really basic docs that I put together for the cities within our service area. So that big long list that I went through at the beginning. The first one has all of our cities, the districts that we were going to be in, organized by district. And the second doc has every city, which districts for that city. So if you live somewhere, you can go through and you can reference what districts your city will be in. And then you can go back and you can see which what other cities you're districted with. Okay, so you've got a little reference guide for that. And then that last link is just the web link to the We Draw the Lines, and you can look at the final report, which has other maps associated with it. So you can go and see the actual maps there and look at those lines and do a little bit of digging around if you'd like. So there's all of that.
I believe the LA Times, I'll take a look and see if I can find the link. I believe the LA Times has a tool on its website where you can see your old district and then kind of convert it to where you are now in your new one. So kind of fun to play around with.
I've got like a tiny thing on one of those docs where I was able to do like a tiny approximation for congressional districts, but I was doing this like a month or so ago, maybe a little longer, when it was still like really hard to kind of like figure out for any of the state or assembly, but for congressional districts, I could do like a little approximation of like, it was this and now it's kind of this. So you could see a little bit of like, if this was your rep before, this might be what it is. So absolutely. But let's get into Q&As. I can see that we have one that popped in. And so we'll start here. Claremont seems to be in CD 28, which is mostly taken up by communities in the Angeles National Forest, along with Pasadena, Arcadia, while the other San Gabriel Valley cities are in other districts. Can you say why it turned out this way?
Yeah, if I remember correctly, the 31st congressional district, which kind of cuts up in between the 28th, that's a Latino VRA seat district. So we were looking at the VRA considerations there first. As I mentioned, that was kind of generally our approach was to work on the VRA regions first. So that district was being carved out. Portions of San Gabriel Valley in that area are also included. Those are predominantly more of the AAPI areas, which had asked to be kept with the Angeles National Forest and that 210 corridor. We had actually had quite a lot of testimony from environmental groups, as well as like this, I forget which group it was, but I remember the testimony. It was a combination of social justice and environmental justice. And they talked about the need for some of these more landlocked communities to be able to access the forest and to have an entryway into it. So what you'll see is some of those SGV communities being connected into the 28th. And even in the 31st, however, we've pulled up and added a portion of the forest. We had a bunch of testimony about, again, making that connection for communities, and so that the representative themselves, right, has an interest in what happens to the land management. And so they have an interest in ensuring that there are pathways into the forest, or that when there are forest fires right up against cities, that they can be involved in those discussions and that process as well. So we actually had a lot of testimony about the needs of the Angeles National Forest, and so that's why it looks that way.
I want to talk a little bit about what happened 10 years ago too, because it was a different kind of a situation, where the AAPI communities in the San Gabriel Valley, in more kind of south of Pasadena is where I think of it, yeah. Pulled themselves together and realized that they had a lot of shared interests. And it was kind of, the way it's described to me was, it was kind of eye-opening for a lot of people. And they got together and they advocated successfully to the 2010 commission to be kept together as a district, even though that they technically could have been considered a whole bunch of little communities, but they said, no, our interests are communal, and they advocated, and that was a new kind of AAPI communities advocating together as opposed to individually, so I think that they continued that advocacy in this cycle too.
Great. I hope everyone can see, I tried to bring up the map with the congressional districts for the area. So hopefully some of the people can see what Sara was just talking about with that 28th district, and the way that the 31st kind of like digs up a little bit into the hillside in a way that it did not before. And then that 28th district, I've been calling it the rainbow. It's the rainbow district now. So you can kind of see that was a little bit of what Professor Sadhwani was talking about. We have a thank you for your service to our state. It's heartwarming to hear that the approach to redistricting was quite a bipartisan at the commission level. So that is a thank you to the commission work. And then another question, can you speak to the impact of Shelby v. Holder on requirements for redistricting under the VRA?
Yeah, sure. And thank you to Eileen for that question. So I think, first of all, just to back up a little bit, that requires a little bit of knowledge about the VRA itself, right? The federal VRA. And so, under the federal VRA, Section 5 previously required certain states or counties that were covered by the VRA to have their maps or changes in their election law to be reviewed in a process known as pre-clearance by the Justice Department. The Shelby County case from 2014, I believe, invalidated the pre-clearance formula of Section 4, which ultimately invalidated Section 5. So pre-clearance is no longer a matter for redistricting in this cycle. And that's a very big and real change. It's why we're seeing so many states, especially in the South, where many of those states were covered, why we're seeing so much, such a tumultuous process, I suppose, in those other regions. In California, there were 3 or 4 counties that had been previously covered: Kings, Monterey, and Yuba. My understanding from 2010 was that meant that they started in those counties with the redistricting process to ensure that they would be able to get pre-clearance. That was not the case this time because of that Shelby County ruling, and that meant we didn't have to start there. I think for the case of California, that probably worked out okay. We were still able to look at and assess California from a Section 2 standpoint in terms of creating those districts to ensure that historically excluded communities would have that kind of coverage. And so it allowed us to actually rethink our approach, particularly in like the Kings and Kern County areas of the Central Valley, and how we would approach those areas. In addition, and I had actually pressed our lawyers on this issue, and anyway, it was an important issue to me. There had also been an important VRA case in Kern County and their Board of Supervisors within the last 10 years, in which it was found that there had been vote dilution of the Latino vote in the county. And that to me was really important, just a point of information to ensure then that we're taking a look at what the demographics of the Latino community are in that region, which includes the Bakersfield kind of area. And certainly we spent a whole lot of time and received an enormous amount of testimony coming from the Central Valley, where we were able to create 3 VRA districts throughout in the congressional maps throughout the Central Valley.
I'm just going to add one more historical note on this too, that our California law specifically delineates compliance with the Federal Voting Rights Act as one of the criteria that the State Commission needs to comply with. And that was, as that initiative was being written, there were questions about that. It's like, of course you have to comply with federal law, but we wanted to call it out very specifically and make it very clear that that was a piece of what we expected. And so going forward, we don't know what state the Federal Voting Rights Act is going to be in 10 years from now, but we've called it out specifically in California. So hopefully that will do something to reinforce that message.
Thank you. Got a few more questions coming in. We'll go into a question that came into the chat that I kind of looked at and I was like, oh, we need our Supreme Court person who is not here this weekend. But we've got a hot topic right now is the politicization of the courts. Do you think that this commission structure can be applied to curate a list of politically neutral Supreme Court nominations? And I think perhaps Either one of you could, but perhaps Helen might have.
I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
it's an interesting idea to think about.
Yeah.
I think the law says now that the president is going to name them, and I think they do pull together lots of people to think about it. Whether you'd have an independent commission, it's an interesting idea.
Yeah. Maybe once we expand the court, right?
Give them term limits. I mean, the league doesn't like term limits generally, but maybe for the Supreme Court, we might like that. I don't know.
We have another one that's a little bit Claremont specific, but also might be expanded a bit. And this person says Claremont is currently engaged in their city council redistricting, which is under the CVRA. All proposals for original districts and now redistricting proposals by the consultant prioritize making districts for each council member. How did state commission address and avoid districts influenced by where currently elected legislators live as law requires?
Yeah, I'm curious who the consultant is for Claremont. You know,
I'm not sure that I fully agree that that is the situation. I think that that is maybe up for debate.
Up for debate. Okay. Well, so for us, you know, there's so many legislators that we really didn't know, or we didn't think about it. Honestly, I mean, the 14 of us, I mean, we weren't particularly political people. I mean, I know I'm a political scientist, but I can't say that I keep a list anywhere, even beforehand, of where all of our legislators live or anything like that. So we were truly drawing the lines. And I do think this, I think that this is accurate of all 14 of us. I don't think anyone had any nefarious, you know, ideas about trying to draw seats for incumbents. We were truly basing it on the testimony that we received, on our VRA analysis that we had, and then you know, doing a little bit of trial and error, right? And does it work this way? Can we keep more of a community together if we draw it this way versus that way? What if we move the line a little bit more to the right? Can we make it a cleaner line, or maintain the city border to some extent? Certainly, some of the testimony that came in, particularly near the end, and I think this is a lesson learned for communities on the ground also, a lot of the testimony that came in early in the process, for me in any case, was what I ended up relying upon. Because as the process was going on, it was so clear that a lot of the commentary coming in was political in nature, to such an extent that some of the emails that we would receive, which all end up getting posted on our website, but they would literally say, you know, State Senator so-and-so told me to write you guys. They're like, well, we don't want to know that, you know? So it really wasn't an issue for us. Our line drawing team, our consultants didn't draw lines for us. We drew them. We drew them in live session, and they were there to mechanically move the line on our behalf. But you know, we operated differently in that way because we were doing live line drawing. In many other instances, commissions will have a consultant go out, draw a couple different proposals, and then submit them, present them. And what is present, that I don't know if that's how it's happening in Claremont or not. I haven't been following the process very closely, but in that instance, you're relying heavily then on your consultant to use their own judgment in how to draw those lines. Live line drawing is not easy. It's very difficult. Tensions rise, especially when you have 14 people who have never done this before and don't necessarily understand the implications of if you move here, then you can't move there, and or you're going to throw off the entire map. It can be extraordinarily frustrating. But I think the value of it is that you really see what information points are being prioritized. And I do not believe at any point in time incumbent address was a priority for any of the commissioners. I think what we've seen is that actually there are a whole lot of legislators in this, especially in the state legislature, who have been displaced. So I don't think that was an issue for us at all.
No, remember when I said that democracy can be messy? This was part of the messy part, but it worked, and it ended up being that. I will say that 10 years ago, the commissioners said when they first drew the maps, they said we had no idea where the current legislators lived until they released their first draft maps, and they read the newspapers the next morning, and then they knew where everybody lived. But it doesn't, I mean, I think both times the commissioners were great about just ignoring that and listening. There was so much else that you needed to listen to, and including sorting through all of the testimony that they got, like Sara talked about, when I think when you listen, and sometimes I'd Google who it was that was talking, and they were a party official from some area. And, at that point, it's kind of like, okay, well, you have an interest in that one. So.
I will say, I think that one of the distinctions is that, like, in a small town where like Claremont, Laverne, San Dimas, that are these, like, 30 to 50,000 people, the city council is the final say on the maps that are deciding their fate in the next election. So you might have kind of this independent consultant and community process, but ultimately it still is political. And that can be, that's why I'm saying, like, I don't know as much, and this is as much my own personal opinion as it was the questioners. So that's just me. I am just a single person observing a process, just like the commenter. So she is maybe right, and I may be wrong. But I do think that there is probably plenty of politics in it, because it is the school boards, it is the city councils that are deciding on it. It is not an independent process, but I don't know that I think the consultants are the nefarious body. But it is super political. So there's a lot of comments here about who our consultant is now and about, like, their ties to Claremont, and absolutely. But I would really like to, like, zoom out and remember that we're going to be a little more regional and not get dug into, like, Claremont's redistricting process right now.
Let me talk a little bit about local redistricting, because there are new rules for cities and counties in California this cycle, that even if the city council is drawing the lines, they have to follow ranked criteria that are essentially parallel to the state commissions, but applied to a city or county government. And so they do have those ranked criteria. They don't apply to school districts or special districts or any of those, but cities do have to follow those ranked criteria and have to have a kind of a minimal number of public outreach meetings. So
we've got a question here. Were computerized models helpful in California redistricting, or not so much?
We didn't use any computerized models. It was actually an idea that we had loosely discussed as a brainstorm, if you will. I'm certainly familiar with kind of the movement towards the computerized models. There's a couple professors at Harvard that are working on it, Joey Chen as well. So it's definitely a movement. I think it would be really hard to use in the commission process. And in general, I think that I think to me, the path for computerized models is not that there's no place for them, but that they would be a starting point. My colleague, Angela Vasquez on the commission had said at one point that redistricting is the greatest art project. And I tend to agree with that, right? I mean, you want a personal touch on it. You want to know when, you know, a portion of a community has been split, and if it's possible to move the line, you know, 2 blocks north, that you can keep them together. And I think in the computerized world, you can, there's a lot you can do with it, right? I mean, you can really use it to maximize all different kinds of criteria. But at the end of the day, I think having maps with a human touch on them is really the best plan.
And I would say, as a retired computer programmer, I'll say that somebody had to program into it those lists of the decision-making process that we are asking the commissioners to do as human beings. And so, because there's trade-offs, no matter how you draw those lines, there are going to be trade-offs, even within communities of interest, because communities overlap. So which one are you going to do? Respect.
That's right. I do think in 10 years that the technologies that we're using will continue to expand and be enhanced. Certainly, I think the communities of interest testimony, and what was fascinating was behind the scenes, our crew was digitizing every piece of testimony that we received, if it was specific enough. And so on our website, there's a database where you can pull up maps of all of the communities of interest testimony that we received. I think more could have been done to, you know, take a bird's eye look at where all of that communities of interest testimony lies. Where are there overlaps? Can you identify those places where it would make sense to pull communities together based on all of that mapping and all that work? But also, I mean, it's an issue of time. And so I think we made progress this time around from 2010. And I have no doubt that by 2030, there will be additional innovations that are made.
I have a question here. Is it safe to say, and this is kind of a political question, so it may not be something that you can answer, but is it safe to say that Judy Chu, Anthony Portantino, and Chris Holden will continue to represent, and he says us, which is definitely referring to Claremont, as legislators, barring possibilities of being termed out? So I guess that is to say, like, what is how safe do you feel are some of the districts? So that would be like the new District 28, which is the district that Judy Chu has been now drawn into. District 41 is, I think, Holden's district. I can't remember what Portantino's is. I believe, let me look it up. That would be District 25. Senate District 25 is where Portantino will be.
Yeah.
So all of that is to say, any political
I think wearing my redistricting commissioner hat, I officially have no comment. If I put on my political science hat, I'm quite certain that Portantino and Holden are up against term limits fairly soon. So if they can run and win, good for them, but I'm pretty sure they're terming out fairly soon, which begs the question then, where do they go? I'm sure that these are career politicians at this point, so I'm sure they'll be looking for new opportunities, perhaps in some of the other maps that I didn't draw. So I would keep an eye out for that.
And just from everything I've done, there's no indication that Judy Chu will not run, and there's no indication that she would not win her seat, just from the research that I have done. So, who knows what the future holds, but that is word on the ground. Let's see. We have another one that says, were all the California congressional and state legislative districts dramatically redrawn like our local ones, or did many districts stay basically the same?
I think there's a lot of areas where you do see similar constructions, but overall, we cleared the map and started from scratch. We weren't looking at the former districts at all. So there are, I mean, for example, the 28th that you just mentioned, I think you earlier called it the Rainbow District. It's different from what the district is now. But you can see kind of similar constructions. And I think that is driven by the communities of interest testimony, right? As Helen was laying out from 2010, this push from API communities and being linked with the mountains. And we certainly received a lot of that testimony this time around. So that's why you see the similar construction, but again, not the same. The other key piece, of course, is California lost a congressional seat for the first time. And so there has, of course, been major changes. We've gotten a lot of questions in other talks about, you know, the areas of Long Beach and the district that was kind of formed there. Certainly, there was a lot of conversation about that region. We never identified it as the place where the lost seat would come from, but I think many people have now look at that region as being where two former districts laid, and now there's one. I think actually what happened was in the congressional maps, we had originally planned to start from Los Angeles and move downward, knowing that Los Angeles is the key to much of the rest of the state, right? It's a very complex place. There's a lot of communities of interest, a lot of VRA considerations, a number of different interests that we're trying to balance. And then on the day of, we actually, you know, we used a rotating chair system. So we got in that day and the chair said, no, we're going to start in San Diego and work up. And that changed the nature of the map in many ways. Again, the congressional maps operate on very tight deviations of one person, right? That equal population is coming down to one person. So once we kind of finalized San Diego and then moved further north to Orange County, things were kind of already locked into place in our draft map. And there wasn't a deep desire to go back. Orange County was extraordinarily difficult as well. We had a ton of testimony from Orange County, as you can imagine. So we were slowly working our way up. And I think that we ended up getting locked in some ways, given the approach that we had taken.
There's an Orange County district that reaches all the way up into our service area. That's a really like kind of a bonkers district, for lack of, I call everything bonkers, but it's a very like long, narrow kind of arching district that goes up through the Southland, that I'm like, oh, that must have been an interesting conversation to shape that one.
Yeah. And again, a lot of times that's based on the ensuring VRA compliant districts right around them, right? So then sometimes districts aren't as compact as you might hope, but they're legally compliant. So that's the good news.
Yeah. And I noticed it because it like a tiny piece of it hits right up into, I think it hits up into either Diamond Bar or Chino Hills, one of those. Yeah. There's just a couple of little comments that I'm gonna get right back into questions, but the person that asked about the Claremont representatives, he wanted to know if they still live in those new districts, about Cortantino and Chu and Holder, and yes, they do. So to answer those, the answer is yes. And then we had another comment about that there are interesting things about some supervisory. Somebody else is going to have to say that word.
Supervisorial.
There it is. Districts. And that is the county districting is something that I haven't had a chance to dig into yet, because I've been doing a bunch of like local stuff and then looking at the state stuff. And I think the county things are going to be really interesting as well.
The county ILO watched that very carefully. So you will hear from them about that one.
And we do have, for everybody here listening, the LA County League Convention is coming up on March 26th. I was a bit remiss to not make that announcement as well. Apologies. We will be sending out information through an email, but there will be, I'm sure there will be a report on that at that convention. And you know, that is something that they definitely were following. And absolutely, I'm sure the way that those lines changed will affect our, at least half of our service area. But to get to these last few questions that we have in the Q&A, this first one I find is pretty interesting. How did our ongoing housing crisis impact your decisions-making process on drawing lines? Which I think is kind of interesting. Is there anything around like housing that creates like, I don't know, interest, like communities of interest?
You know, the housing did come up a little bit in some of the testimony. I'm recalling, for example, NELA, the Northeast Los Angeles areas, Eagle Rock, Highland Park, Glassell Park, Mount Washington. Certainly, we had some testimony in that area, in those regions, about gentrification and maintaining Latino presence and keeping the Latino community together, that even though they didn't, from our analysis, kind of meet the criteria that we were looking for VRA districts, there was an interest nonetheless to kind of keep Latino communities in that area together because of the changing nature of those regions. Certainly that NELA area, I live kind of close to there, it's changing a lot, right? You know, what used to be mom and pop taco shops and things are now acai bowls and such. And so there was definitely conversation about that when we were drawing in those regions, and testimony as well. But I don't think it necessarily was a significant factor in redistricting, but certainly something that came up. You know, a lot of talk about the expansion and growth of the population in the Inland Empire, with slower growth of the population in Los Angeles, largely due to housing affordability, and seeing some of those changes. Similarly, up north, you know, Stockton and the Sacramento area has undergone a lot of changes, largely driven by housing affordability and demands for housing. We've seen population shifts. So I think it came up in loose ways, but not necessarily in a direct, as a direct component that we necessarily had to account for when drawing.
And I'll add that from the people who were advocating the discussions, it was equally kind of on the periphery of the discussions that we had, but it was more about protecting communities and protecting community voices. And housing is a big piece of that. But it was that we wanted to protect those community voices and make sure that they were heard. So.
Thank you. Do you have a preference between our current one-seat winner-take-all and other countries' multi-seat proportional representation system as it relates to the redistricting process?
I feel like that must be from one of my students asking me.
I think maybe.
You know, I think there's a lot of momentum around proportional representation, as well as ranked choice voting, that we're seeing. You know, I'm officially on the record in some of my writings talking about the values of proportional representation, and that could be a system that could create better opportunities for representation, particularly for communities of color and historically excluded groups. In Los Angeles in particular, I think it's a funny and interesting thing to think about, because, and actually I'm talking with some colleagues about the possibility of exploring this further. You know, Los Angeles, as I've mentioned, has a number of VRA considerations for the Latino community, but the commission was pushed very hard to also uphold historic Black communities of interest as well, throughout the city, as well as looking closely at API communities of interest. And it does make you pause and wonder if these single member districts are really the best way for these smaller communities to have adequate representation, to have responsive representation. And that's kind of my larger sort of academic concern. That being said, I'm also a pragmatist. So I don't see the path forward legislatively to switch to proportional representation anytime soon. But I have to tell you, the momentum, the number of students that I have that are fired up about proportional representation is super exciting. And I totally believe our Claremont students can change the world. So I look forward to proportional representation in the United States in the future if they can bring it.
I love it. I'm so excited for your students to take over the world. That's great.
Me too. We need their leadership.
I always tell when I go out and I do student voter registration, I'm like, all of the old people are voting. Are you sure that's who you want? And then they're like, oh, okay. Next question. Since the census time delay allowed more commissions to educate the masses on the redistricting process, would you say that started education projects? Would you say that starting education projects or testimony collection before census data releases is beneficial for more equitable redistricting practices?
I have thoughts, but Helen, do you want to weigh in on this? Because I feel like
yeah, I want to weigh in because yes, there is value in that, but the reality is that until there are draft maps, you're not going to get as much reaction. And we kept trying to say that to the commissioners as they were trying to do outreach, because we knew that until people see a draft map, they're not going to react. That until then, it's theoretical. And until you say, here's the draft, here's a picture about how your community is going to be drawn, you're not going to get as much input. Which is not to say we don't want to do lots of outreach. Continue to do all of the outreach and as much as you can and education about it, but recognize that we all need that visual cue to be able to react. So, and I'm not saying draw draft maps before the census data is available, because I think that is a really stupid idea, because they're not realistic. Until we know what the census data really is, we can't have draft maps.
Yeah, I agree with that. That being said, I do think that there's probably more that can be done to link some of the education around redistricting with education that's done around the census. I think that that's a time period where we have a lot of activity. And, if some entrepreneurial minded person was out there and wanted to think about how to better do that, I think that's a really great opportunity. Or is there structures that are created during the census that could be maintained and leveraged towards redistricting in ways that will get more people involved. I think actually, Helen, I completely agree with you. I know many of my colleagues were really upset that we didn't have more testimony in advance of the maps. And I kept saying, we're gonna get it, don't worry. I think actually that's one of the reasons why I do think some of the computerized maps could be an interesting tool. Again, I stand by that you have to have a human touch on it. But if the census data comes out on Monday and by Wednesday you can generate a whole bunch of maps and have them out there for the public debate, it might stir folks up, right? One of the challenges of the draft map was for us as the commission. We knew it was a draft. We knew we were not done. But then, the media picks up on it and kind of plays it out as though this is what the maps are going to be. That's not what the process is even meant to do, really. Not in my mind, right? It's meant to generate feedback. It's meant to have folks tell us what we're getting wrong. But anyway, it is what it is. Thoughts for the future.
since the census time delay allowed more time for commissions to educate the masses on redistricting process. Oh no, did we just do that?
Yeah, I think we had that one.
Okay. Would creating independent redistricting commissions in states that don't have them reduce the demand for the reinstatement of federal pre-clearance for redistricting changes to Section 5 of the VRA? So if more states were California, would we need Section 5 of the VRA reinstated?
How would the commissions be chosen, and how would they be, and what kind of rules would they be given? I think it's dependent upon that to know whether they're going to actually, how idealistic they will be.
Yeah, I think that's right. So I'm going to embark on a new adventure. I'm teaming up with a researcher at Stanford who's been looking at redistricting for many decades, Bruce Kane. And we're going to be looking more closely at a comparison of commissions across the US and specifically looking at some of these factors. I think the composition of commissions matters a lot. And while the 2020 California Citizens Redistricting Commission was certainly friendly towards the Voting Rights Act, if you will. There was no commissioners actively trying to skirt our responsibilities under the law. Put in a different 14 and it could turn out very differently. So I do think that the composition of the commissions matters a whole lot. And it's not foolproof, if you will. It's not to say that you can't have actors who occupy those positions that would not want to adhere to the Voting Rights Act or to not, have a close following of the letter of the law. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. That concludes the questions that are open right now. So unless anybody else has something to ask, I think you both have been such wonderful wealths of information. We're so grateful to have you with us today to bring all that you have learned in this process. We're also grateful for your service to the state of California, for the work that you've done. We're really lucky here in the state to have the process that we have in districting. We've seen this year what it is like in other places, the lack of representation that communities receive when redistricting is politicized in the way it is. So I think we're really grateful to live in a place like California that has done this, and to have the League of Women Voters have taken the role to make this process what it is. So thank you, both of you. Thank everybody for coming, and those of you that stuck it out through the end of Q&A. We will be putting this video up on our YouTube channel so everybody can view it later at their leisure. And with that, everybody enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Farewell.